Hello, testing, testing, one, two, three. I can't be too loud because it's something in the morning, sometime. But yeah, I got some stuff done with the damage sources in the game, right? Because a bunch of stuff's gonna do damage. It's crazy, I know. Um, but yeah, I'll reset this actually real quick. I'll just set that to that. Yeah. Um, So what I've been working on is in the scripts damage system folder, there's two scripts that I've added and a couple scripts that I've removed. So there was a script called base bullet, which was um, used on the test enemy that was like shooting out some default bullets. Um, yeah, that's gone. It's been renamed because base bullet doesn't exactly make much sense. And also a lot of that code has just been reused, but it's also been completely restructured in that Um, this is the core of what I've been working on, the base damage source. Now, if you look at the forum documents that we have, a lot of them do damage. I know it's crazy. And they do damage in different ways. Um, whether it's a projectile or there's a lot of melee attacks. Um, there's a lot of just areas where damage is dealt, etc., etc. That kind of stuff. So I'm like, well, we need some kind of base to build upon, right? And this ties into the status system as well. So, um, yeah, I'm gonna go show that. So the base damage source here, it's a mono behavior, and it has three main things you tweak before you even think about numbers, right? For like stats and stuff. So there's the action trigger type, the persistence type, and the contact persistence type. Now, I know these two probably could be named something different, but you'll see what I mean in a second, right? So I'm going to open Chrome again real quick. So if you think about in a lot of games, right, there's a bunch of different projectile and damage types, right? One thing that came to mind for me was there's beams, there's bullets, there's melee, stuff like that, right? And if you know how Brimstone works in Binding of Isaac, you know that um, it's a ticking laser, right? So it's a persistent projectile that appears there and moves with the player, right? But it ticks over time. It does its damage over time and is persistent. It doesn't care whether it's hit an enemy or not, right? And so that's what all this stuff is here, right? And of course, these can be built upon new units can be added here. But basically, what this is this first clause here, the action trigger type, is asking, um, should we run the action on impact or should we run it over time? So for something like a brimstone laser, it would be running it over time, right? Um, so just to show you what the action I'm talking about is, when this is the default, right? Because this is a base class, we're saying, hey, you can, all these functions are virtual and public. So if you make a different type of like projectile or whatever or class that is different to this, you can totally just overwrite this. But by default, the impact action deals all the statuses that this damage source is supposed to apply, if there is any, and then it starts a coroutine to deal damage. Now, there's a reason why this is a coroutine, and I'll explain it in a bit. But to go up a bit, you will see, um, yeah, that's what the action is. So if action on impact is the action trigger type, right, then it will run the action when it hits a thing, right? And the way that this works right now is it assumes that um, one, there's a collider on this game object that has this component attached to it, right? There's a 2D collider attached to it. So all the collision stuff is handled down here. Don't worry about all that. I can get to that in a bit. And um, yeah, and then action over time completely it ignores collision to trigger the action, but it doesn't ignore it in adding it to the list of things this projectile is colliding with. You will see. Um, so, for example, with action over time, right, in the awake function, you'll see if the action trigger type is action over time, then it will start a coroutine called the action routine. And what that is It's super simple. It's just it has a small delay at the beginning, but after that, while this projectile or damage source, it doesn't even need to be a projectile, it can be like a melee attack, whatever, exists. As long as it exists, it will do the impact action, and then it'll wait for the cooldown that you set for it, and then it'll do it again. I know, crazy. Um, but what is this dealing damage function, right? How does that work? Well, there is a list of damageables that these damage sources have called the contacted damageables list, right? And what this is it's a list that's updated in real time of the damageables that this thing is supposed to do damage to, right? So if you think about something like a bullet, right? The You can imagine, and I'll actually just scroll down to like on trigger enter right here, or on collision enter. On collision enter, damageable target damageable equals find damageable target on the thing you hit on the collision, right? Uh, I wrote this function here. I'll explain that later too. But if the target damageable is not found, so if there's nothing there, or if it's already contacting that damageable, so if the list of contacted damageables already contains the thing that you found, like if it hit it twice somehow without doing damage yet, then return, just stop. But if it's not in the damageables list yet that it's contacted, add it to the list. And then if the action trigger type is do an action on impact, then do the action. And that is this true for all of these. So this works for colliders and triggers as well. And when things exit the trigger, that they're removed from the list if the contacted damageables list contains it. So this is the logic of like if you walk into the brimstone beam, right? Because something like a brimstone beam would be something like a trigger rather than a straight up collider, right? If you walk out, then the damageable is removed from the list of contacted damageables. Um, anyway, going back to the dealing of damage, right? Um, basically, we go through the list of damageables in the contacted damageables list, right? And we say, uh, if they're in that list, apply the damage to them. And this is where contact persistence comes in. If the contact persistence type is set to remove on damage, then we will remove that damageable from the list of damageables um, once that happens, once they take damage. Basically, it means it only takes damage once. So you can imagine, right? Why is that important? So imagine that you have a melee attack, like Isaac's Spirit Sword, right? You have Isaac's Spirit Sword, right? So imagine that this is a trigger or a collider or something, right? And you're swinging it, and you swing it, right? And if this is not set to remove on damage, you can imagine that imagine I hit two enemies, right, in a single swing, right, and the sword hitbox is still touching the first enemy. So I'll imagine this is the sequence of events. I swing the sword, I hit the first enemy takes damage. It's still on the list of contacted damageables, and it still hasn't left this list down here, this contacted damageables list, because it only leaves when it exits the trigger, right? And then in that same swing, I hit a second enemy, but the sword is still inside of the first enemy, so it technically hasn't exited the trigger, right? And so it's still on that list. That's what the setting is for. We can remove the damageables from the list if it's necessary. And in some cases, it's not going to be necessary. In some cases, you want to hit. Um, you don't want to remove things from the contacted damageables list, and that's totally okay. There's another setting for that. Um, And lastly, there's this middle setting here that I kind of skipped over, the persistence type, right? And so in most games, in most bullets, right, you hit an enemy and the thing is destroyed. That's it, end of bullet, right? Um, that's what that setting is. Persistent means it doesn't care whether it hit the target. It will just keep on going, keep on doing its thing like nothing happened after hitting the target. Destroy on damage means that this projectile or damage source will get destroyed when you do damage. On the first hit, you do damage on, right? So, um, and when I say destroy, I'm not actually destroying the game object, if that makes sense. What's actually happening is that there's um, a function called on death, right? And so when you think about things in a game, um, there's a couple ways of doing things like um, death, like how do I put it? Things that happen after a projectile disappears, like a bullet explosion or like a particle effect off the wall or whatever, right? And so instead of just killing off this game object immediately, we're gonna run this thing called the death routine, and this is gonna be customizable per projectile. Like imagine I have a boomerang, and when it hits an enemy and it gets destroyed, right? The boomerang gets destroyed. It does a big explosion. That's what this is for. Um, that's what this is for right here. Or correction, you could put that explosion in the impact action in the deal damage, or rather, I think you just put it in impact action right here. But you could also add something else on death. So imagine the boomerang goes through three enemies, and then it reaches the end of its lifespan, and it does the on death function, which is an explosion. You can imagine what happens there. Um, but yeah, that is that on the coding side. But in terms of actually seeing it in action, this is how it works, at least right now. So first of all the enemies still have, or the player and all the enemies will have their base combatant controller right here. Um, and how the damageable system works, um, and the what is it called? The base damage sources work is that if you have a collider on something with a base combatant controller, it will take that into account. And I've also created a thing called the, where is it? The collision damageable link. So what this is something pretty simple. It sounds complicated, but it's simple, right? Imagine I'm the player, or correction, imagine I'm this red enemy, right? What if we want to make an enemy made up of multiple game objects, right? Multiple chunks and pieces, multiple hitboxes that move and do different things, right? How do we do that? How do we share one damageable? This thing doesn't have a base combatant controller on it, right? But how do we share one health pool of health points for multiple colliders? Well, the answer that I've come up with is we can make multiple game objects, right? And these can have their own colliders on them, like a um, link collision. It's not letting me. Interesting. Did I change the? Ah, I see. Typo. Always forget the E there. Hello? Ah, I see. All the old scripts are looking for the thing without the E. Give me 1 second. Yeah, I'm not editing this out. I'm too lazy. So you're gonna have to deal with it. But this isn't even the main point of the video, but I thought it was something worth mentioning. Um, I have a box collider on this other sprite, not box collider 2D on this other sprite. So this is basically me extending the hitbox of this thing out to two colliders instead of one, right? I'll make it not white so you can actually see the green square around it, right? So to share this one pool of health, what we can do is we can add that link to it and then drag the damageable from here into here. And now they share a health pool. When this thing gets collided with, this box collider 2D gets collided with, it will send a message to the host damageable saying, hey, I got hit by this thing. Or it goes the other way around, but you get the idea. That's something completely different that I added that is important but not super relevant to this. So to actually show the projectiles and stuff in action, I'm going to go into prefabs, and we have this enemy bullet here, and Manas has fortunately set up a very basic enemy AI for us to test with, which has been awesome. It's very simple. It just shoots a bullet. It shoots a bullet at the player. Um, and I should mention this class too. This is base projectile. It inherits from base damage source, so it has all that stuff that I was talking about before, but it just has three simple functions right now. We're going to add more. A speed, a target position, and that's it. For variables, it just applies a force as soon as it spawns in, And when you instantiate it, you set a direction of where you want it to go. So what Manas has done here is uh, the bullet has been instantiated. Uh, we edit the base projectile component of that bullet and set the direction to the position of the player. We just find the player of GameObject.find. I hate GameObject.find, but you know what? It works here. Um, but yeah, so when I press play, it's gonna spawn this projectile, right? And what you're gonna see is that I can, one, edit the settings in real time. Also, debug menu, I added player help up here because looking at the inspector is too annoying. And it's shooting the projectiles at me. That's awesome. That's great, right? Um, but this is the meat and potatoes here, the space projectile component on the prefab, right? So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to actually go through this and change some stuff and show you what the heck's going on and what we can do. That's awesome, right? Um, so I'm going to do like an ordinary bullet. Action on impact, right? So when it hits something, do the action, do the status, do the damage, do it all, right? Persistence type, destroy on damage. This thing, it hits you, it goes away. That simple. Um, and then contact persistence type, remove on damage. This is like the default projectile in most games, right? This is like the simple thing. Lifespan, this is like how long does this thing last just on its own? Like, imagine through some bug the projectile goes out of the map, right? We don't want it living forever. So this would be something like, usually be something like pretty high unless you're making a projectile that does actually decay over time, um, which you totally have access to. But there you go. I'm setting it to 5 by default, and damage I'm setting it to 1 just so you can see the flat numbers. So now all the damage it's going to be there. 1, there you go. And you'll notice I'm not moving at all. And that's because the collider is set to being a trigger, right? So trigger doesn't do the physics collisions, but it does detect, it has the detection elements of a collider without any of the physics elements, right? So if I uncheck this box, you'll see that all the projectiles starting now are going to move me a little bit, right? So you can imagine something like a brimstone beam being a trigger, where like you could have a big square box trigger, right, that moves with the player wherever they're facing, or whatever. Where versus something like a bullet, maybe it's a collider. Anything involving physics is going to be a collider. Maybe most of the bullets are going to be triggers actually, just because there's no collision or anything involved. But you get the idea, right? Um, Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit the persistence of this thing, right? Because it's saying destroy on damage right now. And I'm going to change that to persistent. And now you'll see that all the bullets starting now, I'm still taking damage, right? But the thing is damn persistent. It doesn't care whether it just hit me, and it's just going right through me. Now, of course, anything that the way these projectile systems work is that it's not exclusive to the player. It is totally works for the player's end too. So once we get form set up actually using these projectiles, it'll just work right off the gate because they're both using the same system. But I'm gonna hit F2 to actually give my health back because I don't want to die. But yeah, you can see that right there. That's working. So I'm gonna make something. I'm gonna just make something, right? Um, I'm gonna change this from action on impact to action over time. And what you're gonna see is that um, it actually does an action over time, and I'm not actually taking anything, right? I'm not taking any damage or whatever. And I think that's because the action cooldown is too short, but you'll see. Um, I'm gonna actually ignore the damage call to remove my um the player from the contacted damageables, right? And what you're going to see is that I am taking damage now. Wow, that's crazy. And I'm only taking 1 damage though. That's because the action cooldown is 1. So imagine you want projectiles that do a damage over time effect, right? I can change this action cooldown to something like 0.25, right? Oh my god, that's a lot of damage. Um, maybe that's too much damage. I'm gonna hit F2 again so you can see it again. But you'll see that while I'm gonna follow these projectiles, right? While I'm in the projectile, I'm taking ticking damage over time, right? And that's what that's about. So it runs 4 times a second, and it does 1 damage every 4 times a second, and it runs that action over time versus running on impact, right? And so for something like a melee attack, that would be something that would be action on impact, right? And persistent, but it would remove from the damage call. So you can imagine a a melee swing versus a swing collider versus like this projectile that moves on the XY plane. And what that would do is when you get hit by it, does damage to you, and it persists even though it hit you, but it removes you from the damage pool so you don't keep taking that ticking damage, if that makes sense. Um, and the last part of this that I have set up right now is status, right? Is these statuses to apply. So I'm going to switch it back to the default states right here of like, just shoot me. Yep, there we go. Um, so here you can add statuses to apply. So it's very simple. You just add whatever statuses you want to apply. It'll apply all the statuses from there. So you'll see that, I mean, I don't have a dev panel showing for the statuses I have, but if I can go to the player and show you. Um, so this is the status effect list right here. I don't know why there's so many empty ones. I think that's because I had no status effect on some of the bullets and it kind of broke. But don't worry about that. You'll see that there is one stack of burn damage on me right now. Um, and I'm going to reset my health to 100, and you can see that I'll take the damage from the projectile, and then I'll start taking this ticking damage. And if I get hit by multiple bullets, you'll see that I get more and more stacks of burn damage, and my health is going to, and I'm dead. I'm going to cheat. But, yeah, you can totally see that it's just fucking working. It's awesome. Yeah, that's most of it. Let me look at the enemy bullet again. Their status is there. You can put multiple statuses, and you can preset those statuses to have different durations, etc., etc. Um, and yeah, base projectile has some. It's again, it's very basic right now, but it just has a speed. You can just set the speed. I'll set it to like 10, so you can see the bullets are going to start moving a bit faster. Maybe like 20. Maybe like 20. I feel like that's pretty cool. I'm gonna set myself back up to this, but now these burning shots are just fired at me. But you can imagine a very slow-moving projectile that maybe is a bit bigger, right? Like imagine it's the size of this projectile is like 4 times the size, right? These big ass circles that are coming at me. But it's doing action over time and it's persistent and it's ignoring the damage call. And so as I sit in them, I take ticking damage. Um, and of course you'd make the lifespan bigger, but you know you get the idea. The system is pretty flexible and hopefully it fulfills a lot of the needs that these big ass forum documents have. I think most of them are filled. But yeah, that's all I've got. Good night.